Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's broadcast. I'm Jane Walters.
And I'm Ruth Schneider.
Today is Thursday, November 22nd, 1973. We have a very special broadcast for y'all tonight in commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States. He remains to be the youngest man ever elected president in America at the age of 43. The main focus of tonight's special will be Kennedy's hopes and accomplishments as president. But first, let's begin with his background.
Kennedy was born into a large, affluent, and Catholic family. High expectations were set for him and each of his siblings from a young age. It was inevitable that he would follow the footsteps of his father and enter politics. First, Jack, the nickname given to John by his friends and family, became a lieutenant in the Navy and served in the Pacific Theater fighting the Japanese during World War II. He showed great leadership and bravery during his time of service. Following Jack's time in the Navy, he had a discussion with his father, Joseph Kennedy, about his future. His father convinced him to run for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District. His election in 1946 is what began his political career. The following 6 years, John F. Kennedy served in the House of Representatives and was elected into the Senate in 1952.
During his race for presidency in 1960, Kennedy had televised debates with Nixon. Here's a clip of one of the debates, and it is clear to see who the winner was perceived to be by the American people.
On this issue, why do you think people should vote for you rather than the vice president?
Well, the vice president and I came to the Congress together. 1946, we both served in the Labor Committee. I've been there now for 14 years, the same period of time that he has, so that our experience in government is comparable.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
After winning the presidential election of 1960, Kennedy was inducted into office on January 20th, 1961. Let's take a look back to that historic day.
We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God.
During his inaugural address, JFK laid out his aspirations for the nation.
Kennedy saw the importance of global unity and alliances. He declared in his inaugural address to the citizens of the world, "So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate."
Another key part of his address is when he stated, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world." He said this because this was a time of heightened tension, so he wanted to show the American people he was prepared to take on whatever challenges were to come. And lastly, he summoned the American people to stand up for freedom in the shadow of the Cold War when saying, "Let the word go forth from this time and place, to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and all around the world.
Speaking of the Cold War, it is important to recognize Kennedy's role in the ongoing 26-year-old conflict. While he only played a part for 3 years, he made a large impact on the route of the war and faced the challenges head-on. To this point, the peak of the Cold War was arguably during Kennedy's presidency with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Let's take a look at a diagram of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As you can see, Cuba is a mere 90 miles from the shore of Florida. These missiles were placed strategically by the Soviet Union throughout Cuba to scare the United States and show the power communists held. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, formed an alliance with the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, which made it easier for the Soviets to set up their threat against the United States.
While the missile crisis only lasted 3 days, Kennedy's quick actions were what led to the quick diffusion of tension and the removal of the nuclear weapons. Kennedy became aware of the situation in Cuba after U-2 spy planes discovered the missile launch sites. Soon after his discovery, he informed the public about the conflict in a televised address.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
The strength and composure Kennedy expressed in his address assured the American people that they were safe and that the U.S. was doing all they could to prevent a nuclear war. Many people were surprised by his ability to negotiate and resolve the conflict due to his young age. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not the first time Kennedy displayed his strength as president in times of strife with Cuba.
Only 18 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. Fidel Castro is a revolutionary who had overthrown the Cuban government in 1959. In the beginning, he seemed like he was going to side with America. However, he ended up turning to the communist Soviet Union. The CIA had asked Kennedy to approve a secret plan to overthrow Castro and overturn communism. Kennedy did authorize the plan, and the invasion, which took place on April 17, 1961, was a huge devastation to the Kennedy administration. It marked an embarrassment on Kennedy's presidency and furthered the conflict between Cuba and the United States, which was again shown during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the failed invasion, Kennedy wrote a letter to Chairman Khrushchev explaining the Bay of Pigs incident was not done by American people, but the Cuban refugees. He wrote this letter to deflect the blame to exiles rather than on the United States. He also wanted to assure Khrushchev that the United States had no plans to invade Cuba.
Yeah, this was a bust for Kennedy and took a toll on his popularity. Along with the U.S.'s role in Cuba during the beginning of the 1960s, U.S. military presence in Vietnam grew because of the escalation of corruption and internal divisions which threatened the government of South Vietnam and President Ngo Dinh Diem. As Kennedy said in his inaugural address about wanting peace between nations, he felt U.S. military presence was necessary, taking into account the domino theory. Guerrilla forces backed by the Communist government of the North proposed a sequence of attacks in South Vietnam, and the Geneva Accords started to collapse.
Kennedy and the American people had recognized the danger and harm going on in South Vietnam and responded to the letter President Diem sent addressing his concerns for his country. Kennedy, still striving to eliminate communism and achieve global peace, told Diem that the U.S. was prepared to help the Republic of Vietnam to protect its people and preserve its independence.
The competition between communist and democratic nations held no boundaries on Earth and even continued into space. The space race began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched their satellite named Sputnik 1 into space. This launch shocked America, and jealousy grew.
In May of 1961, Kennedy addressed to Congress regarding America's involvement in space explorations, saying, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important of the long-range exploration of space."
He later went on to explain to the American people the reason behind America joining the space race with the Soviet Union. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond, and we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding.
Hey Jane, do you remember when Kennedy said, "Together let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce" in his inaugural address?
Yeah, he really kept his word and did get us to the stars, even though it was 6 years after his passing. If it weren't for his motivation for the advancement of technology, we would not have gotten to where we are today.
I completely agree. Let's watch the video of the lunar landing in remembrance of Kennedy's great work.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
While space exploration is a very important matter, more domestically, the topic of civil rights grew during the Kennedy administration. During the 1960 presidential campaign, the issues of civil rights emerged. Kennedy secured more than 70% of African American votes.
He was able to gain the trust of African Americans when he showed support for MLK when he was arrested during his protest in Atlanta. Robert Kennedy also helped with the situation by calling the judge to make sure MLK was released. The actions of the Kennedys gave the endorsements by the top civil rights leaders. JFK supported the civil rights movement during his time as president, as well as the equal rights movement.
In 1963, Kennedy passed the Equal Pay Act as part of his New Frontier program. This act prohibits arbitrary discrimination against women in the payment of wages. After signing the act, Kennedy stated, "This act represents many years of effort by labor, management, and several private organizations, unassociated with labor or management, to call attention to the unconscionable practice of paying female employees less wages than men employees for the same job." He also said, "This measure adds to our laws another structure basic to democracy. It will add protection at the working place to the women, the same rights at the working place in a sense that they have enjoyed at the polling place." Kennedy was very proud of this movement.
As seen, JFK had many aspirations for his time in office. He even put off certain projects for the second term he assumed he would have. However, he did not get that second term. Rather, he did not get to finish his first term. On November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy while in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. The assassination greatly affected our nation, and we still continue to mourn the loss of John F. Kennedy to this day.
During his short time as president, Kennedy brought about an enthusiasm around politics and government service that had not been seen prior to his generation. There was a loss of innocence in America knowing that this tragedy could happen. Some even call it the end of Camelot. This political cartoon depicts Kennedy's motorcade as he passes by a sign that says End of Innocence. Patrick Chapati chose this scene because just seconds after passing a large road sign, Kennedy was shot.
Families across the nation were glued to their TVs when they saw this footage. That was heartbreaking to watch. It is hard to know if we'll ever find a leader with as much charisma as Kennedy had.
Soon after the assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed Congress about how America was going to continue the legacy left by the late president. In the words of LBJ himself, "No words are strong enough to express our determination to continue the forward thrust of America that he began. The dream of conquering the vastness of space, the dream of partnership across the Atlantic, and across the Pacific as well, the dream of a Peace Corps in less developed nations, the dream of education for all of our children, the dream of jobs for all who seek them and need them, the dream of care for our elderly, the dream of an all-out attack on mental illness, and above all, the dream of equal rights for all Americans, whatever their race or color. These and other American dreams have been vitalized by his true drive and by his dedication."
As we have seen, Kennedy made great strides for American people. From the moment he was placed in office, he hoped to advance human rights for all, unite nations across the globe, resolve economical and social struggles for African Americans across the United States, and remove communism as a whole. We believe he did accomplish those goals.
When looking back on Kennedy's time in office, it is hard not to compare him to the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Both Kennedy and Lincoln spoke about the concept of freedom in their inaugural addresses. However, they spoke about freedom in different ways. Kennedy talked about the freedom of all nations and the need for global unity. He also discussed freedom in terms of the civil rights movement. Lincoln was regarding freedom domestically within the states, and both talked about and showed their deep understanding of the Constitution.
That is very true. In my opinion, both presidents were wonderful regardless of their flaws. They had much in common, such as their love for God and putting that love at the forefront of what they hoped to accomplish during their presidential career. Another thing they had in common was how inspirational their inaugural addresses were and some of their goals they wanted to achieve. Even with a great gap between their time periods, both Kennedy and Lincoln wanted to create alliances. Kennedy, dealing with the Cold War, wanted there to be world peace and unity between all nations. He was fully aware of the time it would take for nations to pursue peace, and he wanted to push for its accomplishment. On a similar note, Lincoln, handling the situation of the Civil War, wanted all the Confederate states to join back with the Union so there would be peace within the United States. Lastly, and coincidentally, both presidents died by assassination.
Wow, that is quite spooky. Listening to all those similarities between the two? Wow.
Yeah, I know. Now that's all for today. We hope you enjoyed our special broadcast and learned more about John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This has been Jane Walters and Rose Schneider reporting from ABC News.
Back to you, Miss Barnes.